to Pittman Friends podcast. I'm here with my friend Erik Michelsen. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Erik is the chief he's deputy director of Department of Public Works, but the chief of the Bureau of Watershed Protection and Restoration. So let's get into that. We're really going to talk about kind of all things environment in Anne Arundel, the watershed, the bay, everything that you and I work on. I will also say that Erik is our environmental policy go-to, that we meet every month and review a lot of things on environmental policy. But tell us what the Watershed Protection and Restoration Bureau does.
Sure. So the Watershed Protection and Restoration Bureau in the Department of Public Works was created about 12 years ago after the county put in place a dedicated stormwater fee essentially for this work. There had been a little bit of stormwater restoration work that had gone on prior to that, but it was competing in the general fund for dollars and was prior to us getting a much more rigorous permit from the state that required a great deal of additional work.
That was really controversial at the time, right?
It was.
This stormwater fee?
Yes, it was.
The rain tax.
The rain tax. That's what it was called. Yes.
Not controversial anymore because you've done. I say because you've done such amazing work with the projects you've done. But go ahead and tell us what you do with that money and how.
I will. I just want to say one point on that front, which is that it was 2 years ago now, 2024, we had a piece of legislation before the council, basically our financial assurance plan to describe what we were doing, how the county was funding that work for our permit. And Councilman Volke at the time actually said he took an aside and said, I wanted to tell you I was really skeptical and opposed to this idea of a stormwater fee at the time it went into place. He wasn't on the council, of course, but I think it was, still aware of it. But he said as a result of the actions and the transparency of the program that he had really, changed his mind, which was huge,
Yeah.
So in any case, our program is set up to do a couple of things. Again, respond to the regulatory mandates from the state and the federal government in terms of the county's clean water goals, really around the Chesapeake Bay and local rivers, but also to address our stormwater infrastructure. So the closed storm drains under roads and under, communities and that sort of thing that really had been funded, if they had been funded at all, sort of on a as-needed basis for maintenance. And so there had really been no deliberate, intentional way to maintain that infrastructure, which has a really fixed lifespan. And as a result of having this program put in place, we now have dedicated money, about $12 million a year from the capital program that goes to inspecting, maintaining, and replacing that closed storm drain network. So in addition to that, we're doing all the environmental restoration work that you see on our social media. We've got Facebook pages and Instagram and all that good stuff. But doing projects basically going into the developed landscape, back into the developed landscape, and providing stormwater treatment for neighborhoods or businesses that were developed prior to contemporary stormwater management regulations to make sure that the pollutants coming off those surfaces aren't getting into our local waterways.
That's funny. I never even thought about it that way, is that you're going back in, just the way we have to go in and put in sidewalks after neighborhoods are constructed or other infrastructure because we hear often about how new development is in a lot of ways, certainly better than old development. Redevelopment is good for that reason because we have higher standards for how the stormwater is done. So you're going back in outside of where the development was done, I guess, where there's streams and places where erosion is happening and addressing the failures of the past.
That's right. So it's fundamentally opportunistic. We're not using eminent domain to go in and do stormwater projects like you would with a roadway or something like that. We're going back into neighborhoods, ideally where they want us there, and less ideally perhaps where they at least tolerate us being there, and doing these projects to try to improve not just water quality, but really to create quality of life features for the communities as well. And sometimes that takes a little bit of patience and understanding to get there, but we've had a lot of cases where we've been able to do that, and the communities have been a lot happier at the end of the day.
Well, and the ones that I've seen, maybe it's the ones that you bring me out to or the ones that I get invited to go out to, it's often a community group that initiated the project. I remember my very first week in office, I went to Berrywood where there was a project underway under construction, and hearing about how many residents were engaged and how many organizations and nonprofits it took, with you all really taking the lead on the project. And it was, it was specifically to help some fish, and you can tell me where that was exactly, what the impact has been, but creating nature or fixing what humans broke to recreate nature so that we have better water quality.
Yeah, that's a great project, and it was funded through our grant program with the Chesapeake Bay Trust. But the Community Association of Berrywood approached the county many, many years ago and basically said, hey, we've got this situation where we've got a marina that's right on Cattail Creek, in that case, on the Magothy River, and the bulkhead's failing. We've got a big parking lot here. We'd really like to do something that is more environmentally sensitive. And at the end of the day, and a lot of work and effort by the community, they removed their bulkhead. They installed a living shoreline, which is basically like a naturalized feature with vegetation right down to the water's edge. They rebuilt their marina at the same time, not with grant money, but with their own dollars. And then they also did stream work up towards its Asbury Drive in that area, which is an area where there had been fish passage and historical yellow perch spawning area. So they're very happy. That project has really become a model for great ways to recapture, reclaim those areas.
It's working. Good, good. And you mentioned a couple others. Are there? I mean, we get reports, and anybody can go to your website and see the list of all the projects all around the county that are underway. Any that are happening now that are particularly exciting?
We do have a couple of really cool projects going on right now. One is, again, another grant project with the Arundel Rivers Federation on the South River. It's at South River Farm Park, which is on the south side of the South River, just in front of Selby Bay. So
I know it well.
You know that area,
awesome.
Turkey Point, near Turkey Point.
Yeah.
And there's a point of land, a peninsula of land that was marsh, that was eroding away quickly over time, that's going to be stabilized as a result of this. The end goal is ultimately to actually have it maybe be a receiving site for dredge material for local creeks and whatnot to recreate marsh in that area. So we're not hauling it off to a landfill. We're actually putting it back as a natural resource feature and sort of, again, piloting a technology that's of a lot of interest to the Corps and MDE these days.
Wow. Okay, so there's a bunch of those. Great. And that's what you do, right? You do these projects all over the county, and you contract with firms that do the work and with community groups. How did you get into this? What's your background?
So it was kind of an unconventional background. I did my undergraduate in psychology and philosophy, went to graduate school for experimental psychology, got out, did social science research for a little while in D.C., and then started volunteering in the environmental field in the early 2000s. And ultimately, I felt as though that was where my passion was. I went to work for a private sector design firm based in Annapolis for a few years, then became the executive director of the South River Federation at the time, now the Arundel Rivers Federation. Worked there for 6 or 7 years, and then was hired with the county, and I've been here 12 years now. So that's it's been a really fun journey, honestly.
And the first time you and I met was, I think it was a campaign meeting for a guy named Mike Shea, who was running for county executive as a Green Party candidate.
That's right. Yeah, I think that was about 20 years ago at this point.
Yeah,
and it was a long shot candidacy. I think, at that time I lived in Churchton. You were obviously still living in Davidsonville, but it was, there was kind of a frustration among, I think, South County folks about some development attempts in that area and sort of the county's focus in terms of doing development activity and kind of a pushback against that. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate having people in the bureaucracy of government who are making the machine work, whose background is coming out of a place of passion for the cause. And obviously, you crazy Green Party people are pretty passionate. Okay, so I think most people in the county have learned by now that the Chesapeake Bay and the waterways are only as good as the land around them and the way that land is treated and handled. And one of the things that we've done in the county, and we talk about a lot of these in our monthly meetings, is take opportunities to protect land in perpetuity and keep it from being developed so that it doesn't have the fast water coming off of roofs and things like that. So we've done a few. Quiet Waters Retreat, I think, was the first one since when I was county executive that was going to be developed. Do you remember how that came about?
Well, I mean, it's a great piece of property right there between Quiet Waters Park and Hillsmere, and I know the acquisition went on. There was some discussion about potentially, I think, maybe having some an environmental center or something like that there. But
the neighbors didn't like that for some reason. But we won't get into that. I've talked enough about that one. But But Rec and Parks has engaged the community in a plan for what
that
to do
property.
there.
Yeah, but Quiet Waters really is the the gem of the county park system. I mean, although there's several, Downs Park, there's some really great parks in Anne Arundel County, and so protecting that area on the periphery was a great thing.
Yeah, and that has an amazing view. It's adjacent to quiet waters, and you can now access it, and there's going to be some better trails and some overlook pavilions, but it's one of the best views in the county, looking off practically a cliff out across the South River and into the bay. So that would have been houses, would have been, very expensive homes that were going to be built there. They had it all subdivided and ready to go. So I was thrilled when we were able to acquire that as county with some help from the feds. And then a more recent one was Glebe Heights. You've been down there, right?
Yes, yeah. A great piece of property. Again, lots of almost all woods and sort of wooded wetlands, drainage down to Glebe Creek and Glebe Bay there. Again, was subdivided, going to be 40 or 50 homes. And right there next to Lock Haven Park. So protected, will be retained for some passive recreational use. And really, again, most of the land that's left at this point or a lot of the land, let's put it that way, is marginal. I mean, that's why it's taken so long to get developed. There's a lot of environmental
marginal
resources.
In terms of developability, yeah.
In terms of developability, but maybe high in natural resources.
Depending on what our regulations are and what we approve for development.
Sure.
So
this is true.
I remember Glebe Heights right near there was a parcel that they had just clear cut all the trees, and there was a stop work order from the Maryland Department of the Environment because the developer hadn't identified the fact that there was a wetlands there, and it was sort of sad seeing you could see the wetlands once the trees were all cut down, and it was not probably an ideal site for development. They did end up building a handful of houses there, but we didn't want to see that happen at Glebe Heights. Community certainly didn't. And I was just really thrilled that we were able to finally negotiate a deal with the landowner to protect that. And I think you've been more involved than I have in the Looper property on Magathie. What's that one?
So it's a 250-acre parcel that is just south of I think maybe a 300 or 400 acre parcel that was preserved a number of years ago by the Magathie River Land Trust. This family, the Loopers, sold the original piece of property, and they've basically donated this lower piece of property, which is right on the north side of the Magathie River, not far from Dobbins Island and that part of the river. And it's just in total, it's a spectacular corridor that will be protected. I think Recreation and Parks, may eventually have some plans for some kind of potential water access, like low-impact water access from that property. But most of the property is just going to be preserved as woods on the north side of the Magathie. That's the area of a lot of Anne Arundel County's bogs, which are high-quality wetland resources and these sorts of things. So it's the generosity of that family and the vision of the Magathie River Land Trust continuing to work to preserve these properties throughout the watershed.
Yeah, I know there's a group that's really been pushing us to move quick on that one. And Rec and Parks will engage with the community about. I was just talking to Nick Kipke recently, Delegate Kipke, who lives right there, walks on those trails already, but about the future of it. So that's a really exciting one. And then there's one that we have been in the process for quite some time that we'll be able to announce here soon that we worked with Chesapeake Conservancy on. They actually acquired it, and then we're acquiring it from them, but protecting it in perpetuity. Right behind Bestgate Road, just north of the mall, Salt Works, I think they call it.
That's right, just north of Bestgate. It's kind of off the beaten path. People drive up and down Bestgate Road all the time, but they probably aren't even aware of that several hundred-acre corridor that's back through that location. That Saltworks Creek is interesting there, tributary to the Severn. The Walmart that's there just off General's Highway was probably built on top of the headwaters of Saltworks Creek many years ago. Uh-huh. You've got the bowling alley that's just off General's Highway where the Severn Riverkeeper did some restoration work, and they also have done some restoration work through that tributary. And the watershed is heavily developed already in terms of Annapolis Mall and these other kinds of features. But I think protecting that area will go a long way towards the recovery of the creek and helping us, sustain it.
Yeah, I remember my first knowledge of that land and that forest there was when I guess the Hogan Companies was going to do a development there, and they never admitted it, but they, I will say, cut down a bunch of specimen trees because the larger trees are an obstacle to development and getting permits. So those trees were cut down, I'll say. They paid a fine for the trees being cut down, not probably as much as we could. We changed the legislation so we could have bigger fines, but they're still probably not enough because it's been a practice in the past to have there have been places where land was illegally clear cut, and then you go in for a permit saying, well, there's no forest there. It's sort of absurd. So I think we're getting better at preventing those things from happening, but really thrilled that land is now going to be protected for perpetuity. And we could go on and on. There's over by Two Rivers where they were threatening for the last 30, 40 years to put in a landfill where there used to be some mining is now part of property that the federal government is trying to create a greenway along the Patuxent River. And I've got my fingers crossed. I don't know if the owner, the Halley family, the Cookie Halley, is going to be prepared to really talk about the future of that land when they finally realize they can't put in a landfill there. Maybe they will help us protect that for perpetuity.
Well, it certainly helps. The administration has contributed dollars to land preservation, obviously, over a number of years. We've been able to work with the Department of Inspections and Permits, who has funding through the Forest Fee and Lieu program. And so having the coordination internally of these pots of money to be able to acquire these high-value properties has been critical.
So there's a thing called the Green Infrastructure Master Plan. We do all these plans, Plan 2040. Sometimes the town centers have plans. And we really wanted to identify environmental features at their value and then have plans to protect them. I think, 30% we're trying to protect by 2030.
Right.
And forest conservation, when we strengthened the forest conservation bill, that was part of an effort to make it easier to protect some of that land. How are we doing in that work?
So I think having the mapping has been critical, especially as an internal tool for county staff. Again, when properties come available, somebody wants to donate a piece of property, somebody wants to sell a piece of property, being able to run it through that lens or that filter really helps to say, well, yes, look, this is an area that's core to our protection of these natural resources, or this area is outside of the area of our priority for consideration, and so we may pass it over. But I think in terms of forest conservation, the county is, absolutely on the right track in terms of meeting those goals. With the tightened Forest Conservation Act rules, developers are doing a lot more preservation on site, or if they're having to have tree impacts, they're looking very aggressively at mitigation and off-site options. I've been involved with a number of projects with the Office of Planning and Zoning where they've been, it's sort of a negotiation sometimes in terms of what form does that mitigation take. Is it reforestation? Is it buying easements on existing forests to protect those? Is it doing, meadow enhancements or other kinds of things? And so there's a lot of good work going on that's been spurred on by, I think, a closer examination of the impacts and the gradual forest loss that we've experienced.
And while we're on the big picture of land use, you got very engaged in the effort to pass the redevelopment bill because you argued to the council and to everybody who would listen that by driving development into areas that have already been developed, that it makes it easier. We can grow our economy while still protecting the natural areas, right? Is that
right.
the idea?
Yes, that was the idea. I mean, the reality is, of course, Anne Arundel County is a place where people want to be. We need to continue to have housing for people. We've got corridors where we've got infrastructure that exists and that, a lot of times those areas are not fully utilized in terms of the residential capacity and that sort of thing. So the idea, and what we were hearing also in talking with developers, was there wasn't sufficient levels of flexibility in terms of the zoning in some of those corridors. Maybe they wanted to do more residential than commercial, or vice versa. The market, changes. And so fundamentally, the big component of that bill, I think was 225, was give developers zoning flexibility for redevelopment in these corridors where there's already a level of intensity that's going on. We're not saying I'll open up the whole county to no zoning, essentially, but to try to give some more tools in the toolbox to create incentives for people to do that kind of work.
Cool. Okay, let's move from land use in general, how planning is done and all that, to the role and the engagement of our residents. When you were the head of the South River Federation at the time, you were engaging neighbors in work on the South River. And I know there's an organization called the Watershed Stewards Academy that you really love. I was there on Saturday for their annual springtime event, and it's kind of unique. Watershed stewards are trained. I think they trained another 25 this year. And then they go out and they do projects. There's a Save Our Trees group that deals with invasives as well. Tell us about that work.
Sure. So, as you know, but the listeners may not, the Watershed Stewards Academy was created about 15 years ago. It was a really innovative partnership forged by Anne Arundel County Public Schools, Steve Berry at Arlington Echo, which is the Environmental Education Center for the school system, and then Ron Bowen at the Department of Public Works, who was the director at the time, as well as Suzanne Atkin, who's now the CEO or the executive director of the organization, basically came together and said, look, really, Ron said, we've got these obligations, these clean water obligations we've got to meet as a county. There's no way we can do all of this on public property. Public property is, a quarter of all the property in the county, but most of it's private, and we need to have people who understand why this work should happen and who can become advocates for making it go forward. And really, it was, like I say, the brainchild of those folks grew from fairly humble beginnings to what it is now, which, as you say, is really the predominant program of its type in the state, at least, if not in the region. And so you've got, now hundreds of people who've gone through this program, business people, teachers, stay-at-home parents, all sorts of things, who basically, at a minimum, have sort of an understanding of the environmental needs of the county and the sort of the levers to pull to get things done. One thing I compare it to is sort of like if Leadership Anne Arundel were just focused on the environment, that's kind of what Watershed Stewards Academy does. It's sort of this crash course in environmental action, and we've had people who after that program have gone on to really become champions for local efforts in their communities. So the folks at Berrywood went through the Watershed Stewards Academy program earlier, or just last year. You and I were out with the folks at Chestnut Hill Cove. Gary Gackenheimer was a watershed steward who pulled together, money from the state, from the county, BGE to do this work. Just really special folks. Yeah,
so at this event that the Watershed Stewards Academy did on Saturday, they do the annual Ron Bowen Award in honor of Ron Bowen, who you mentioned, DPW director, founder. And a guy named Rich Pillock was given that award this year. And Don Curtian, who'd been over at the health department with him, both of them work in the health department, and they deal with septic sewers and wastewater. I guess wastewater is the big, the big facilities that I know that Public Works does. But then the health department is the one who looks at these privately owned septic systems. So tell us about that aspect of the work, basically the dealing with the waste and keeping it from going into the bay.
Right. So the county has, I believe it's by far the most septic systems of any jurisdiction in the state, about 41,000 septic systems. And of course, a lot of that's because of our geography. We've got these peninsulas that jut out into the bay, and so it makes it very difficult to have wastewater infrastructure that's not drawn out. And we do have a lot of wastewater infrastructure that's drawn out with pumping stations all over the place and that sort of thing. But these individual septic systems, of course, when that technology was invented, it was intended to create a situation where the bacteria issues, the human health considerations associated with wastewater were addressed. And septic systems, generally speaking, do a pretty good job of that. But one of the things that they weren't designed to do, and they don't do particularly well, is remove the nitrogen that's coming out of the wastewater, the liquids essentially that go into the field, get into the groundwater, and then ultimately travel to our local waterways. And so that nitrogen can become a source of algae blooms and other kind of enrichment in the local waterways. And so one of the things that has developed over the last 20 years or so is technology to reduce the nitrogen coming out of those septic systems. Rich, who you've described, won this award in part because far before it was commercially available, Rich was just kind of like tinkering with some of these fields, trying to figure out ways to extend them. There's many lots in Anne Arundel County that are very small where there isn't a backup opportunity for a septic field, and so you basically have to make that septic field work or try to prolong the life the best you can. And so through things like oxygenation and running the effluent through sand filters and that sort of thing, he's been, like I say, tinkering over decades now really to try to find a relatively low-cost solution for homeowners to be able to make sure their septic systems are not polluting our local waterways. And he does it with an energy. He's been there for over 52 years, which is just incredible.
It's amazing,
yeah. Yeah.
And he was on the stage there, and he at first said he didn't want the award because he doesn't like it to be the center of attention, but clearly, and then he got up there and he started talking about technical stuff. And I think he had a workshop about it as well, that he literally went into his own system and started putting the sand in and building a brick wall in the middle so that the effluent would go over the top. It just was really cool to see how he, as a county employee, lives that work. I think he went and got a degree and came back and continued to do the work, and he hired Don Curtian, who now is his boss, who's been there for 40 years or so. Yeah. So people even inside the government, I love seeing that, where they are innovators. I know that some of the things that he started to do became standards across the state. But then there's the big, DPW. I go to an event that they do every year where they get these awards for, I think it's like platinum, gold, whatever, for all of our wastewater treatment facilities. They get assessed as to how effective they are.
Right.
And so are you involved in any of that work, or you keep track of that?
I keep track of it. It's really run through the Bureau of Utility Operations and Bureau of Engineering, who does the repair and replacement work. But I work closely with those folks. They're great people, and they're very proud of the fact that those plants run so effectively that they have, occasionally there are overflows, that it's almost an inevitability that will happen because, people flush all sorts of things down the toilet that they shouldn't. Sure. They can create, jams in the pipe and have overflows. But they take very seriously protecting public health, protecting water quality, and making sure that those plants are running effectively. And by and large, they're incredibly well run. Yeah.
So you talk about watersheds all the time. That's where the problems lie and the solutions are. Tell us about a grant that the state of Maryland, a grant program, Severn River applied, got funded, the whole Watershed Act, and what that's about.
Sure. So a year or so ago, the state, it was actually when Senator Elfreth, now Congresswoman Elfreth, when she was still in the state Senate, she had led the charge for the passage, it was 2024, I guess, for the passage of the whole Watershed Act. Part of that act was basically, let's take 5 watersheds across the state and focus state money on improving those watersheds. When that happened, I knew Anne Arundel County could be in a great position to receive it. And part of the problem was we had kind of an embarrassment of riches in terms of people who could apply for those. And so one of the goals was, let's talk to all of the nonprofit entities and let's focus our energy, because just the numbers are, you're not going to get multiple awards even if you've got good applications. So we were able to rally around the idea of having the Resilience Authority of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County be the applicant, brought in a bunch of entities from Severn River Keeper, Severn River Association, Watershed Stewards, other groups that are basically plugged in as well, and made an application to the state to have this focused effort on the Severn watershed. I think the whole request was for something on the order of $42 million, even though the max sort of award was going to be $25 million over 5 years. And as you've said, I think it's going to be reduced a little bit. But right now, they're in the process of doing implementation of a number of projects. Most of those this year are in the city of Annapolis, but in the coming years, there will be a lot of implementation work in the county. And one of the cool things about this was that
upstream.
Yes, up the Severn, exactly. But one of the neat things about this was because the administration and the council have been so supportive of funding the county's efforts in the past, we were able to use all of that money basically as match for this application. So when they went to the state, they said, hey, we've got $20 million in match from the county. The county's not asking for any of this money. It's all going to be handled by nonprofits basically doing this work. And that made our application very attractive, and we're real interested to see all this work go into the ground over the next several years.
Yeah, what excited me about that was that it engages part of the application. You had to show how communities would be engaged, and nobody does that better than we do. And both in the city of Annapolis, engaging folks, as well as further upstream, and the watershed stewards that have all been trained. And I remember when the governor did his announcement of the program, it was at Y Island, and he talked about the fact that he didn't really have a relationship with Chesapeake Bay and nature even that much as a kid. But when he took his kids out on a boat and he saw it through their eyes, it all changed for him, and he understood how important it was for people to be connected. So that was a big part of that, and I'm really pumped to see what we can do on the Severn River there. So let's kind of wrap things up. I do want to two parts of what you do briefly. One is you staff the Citizens Environmental Commission, which is organized by Watershed, right? Tell us what that is.
So it's a commission that advises the county on environmental issues that basically involves a group of folks who are interested in sort of intensively understanding what the county is doing from an environmental standpoint, it is organized by Watershed. There are some at-large seats as well. If you just Google Anne Arundel Citizens Environmental Commission, there's web recordings of our meetings and all the minutes and the annual reports on the website. But it's an opportunity for folks who are engaged or interested in getting engaged in the community and having a sort of a deeper understanding in what the county's up to, and have a lot of good back and forth, have the opportunity to review some legislation before it comes before the council and that sort of thing on the environment, and also give feedback on these key environmental issues.
Yeah, they've had important perspectives that we should be listening to, and hopefully that will continue for many years. We created it, I think, early in our first term. And then the last thing that I want you to say something about is the work that you end up doing coordinating the different agencies of county government on environmental issues.
Sure. I mean, this is, again, I've been in the county government now for about 12 years. And one of the frustrations is probably with any big organization is that, sometimes people can operate in silos. I think one of the nice things that's happened over the course of that 12 years that I've been with the county is there's been a lot more interagency cooperation across the board, not just on the environment. But, I'm able to call up the assistant director of inspections and permits, or the assistant director at recreation and parks, or somebody at planning and zoning. If an issue comes up, and try to figure out, well, this may be something that either we can cooperate on, or that's not in my wheelhouse that you may be interested in. And so being able to coordinate on things like land acquisitions, or on how do we—
Tree trimming bill.
Tree trimming, exactly. The tree trimming
The list goes on, yeah.
Or development review processes. It's critical to have those good working relationships and those trust relationships between agencies.
Well, and it's critical to have, but when those conversations are going on, to have somebody at the table whose job it is to protect the environment, to be the environment's seat at the table.
That's true. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for all those things that you do and all of the years of work and passion that have gotten you to this point and playing the role that you play. You get to have the last word, because that's the way we do this.
All right. You're listening to the Pittman Friends podcast. If you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button, share with a friend, and join us for the next episode.